Alrighty, so good evening and welcome everybody. I'd like to start by first, as always, acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all joining the forum from tonight. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging into the future as well, and also acknowledge that this land was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I acknowledge any Indigenous people who are joining us this evening for the discussion. Welcome to you as well. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fourth in a series of 5 Q&A forum discussions on HIV research and the community that are put on by Thorn Harbour Health. Welcome as to whether you're joining from your computer, your phone, or on the live stream this evening as well. And a big reach out to everybody who's either in lockdown and thinking of you through that, or to those who have been recently released from lockdown. Thank you for giving up, I guess, your first night of freedom to join us and to learn more about the future of HIV research. So just for those who don't know me, my name is Chad Hughes. I work at the Burnett Institute. I'm the head of our international development program. So I look after a suite of research and public health programs, mostly across Southeast Asia and in Papua New Guinea, some of which do focus themselves on HIV and other pathogens as well. So tonight we have a stellar cast again, and that Thorn Harbour Health has put together. Our panelists are well known to the sector, so you're in for a treat. These forums, as always, are run as a Q&A session. So I will try to channel my best Hamish McDonald from Q&A and see whether the ABC will give me that gig now that he's decided to depart. Anyway, the way that the Q&A will run is that there's a Q&A button down the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to type in a question for any of the panelists this evening at any point in time, and they will either endeavour to answer that by typing a response or verbally when they come on. What I will do for those of you who are joining us, I think the panelists are well known, very famous in the sector, but either way, I will give a short introduction to them before I ask them their first question so that you'll get to know who they all are. And you can direct your questions either to one of the panelists directly or to the panel as a whole. So, as I said, it's the fourth in a series of 5 of these. Thank you to Thorn Harbour Health for giving us the opportunities to have these discussions. Our experts tonight themselves are either researchers or representatives of the community. And as we've discussed in these forums, it's not really this polar opposite where researchers are researchers and community are community, but the community members here tonight have very much been engaged with HIV research throughout their careers. And the researchers themselves are also very much engaged with community and part of the community because they spend a lot of their time engaging with people living with and affected by HIV. So they're all researchers and community members as far as I'm concerned, which makes for a great panel. The discussion topic tonight is the future of HIV research. So last time we looked a little bit at the past, at the chronology of where we've come from, of what we've learned. Now we're going to sort of talk about where we think the future is going. So my first question this evening is going to be for Professor Sharon Lewin. Welcome, Sharon.
Ed, nice to see you.
Good to see you too. So for those who don't know, which I'm sure there's probably no one joining us that doesn't know, Sharon Lewin is the inaugural director of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. She is an infectious diseases physician and basic scientist. Her research focuses on understanding why HIV persists on treatment and developing clinical trials aimed at ultimately finding a cure for HIV infection. So you can guess that my question is going to be about HIV cure. It's probably a little bit of a loaded question in the sense that we're talking about the future, so it makes the assumption that this is perhaps part of the future of HIV research. And the question for you, Sharon, really is, is there still an appetite for HIV cure research, and will we get a cure? Where are we at? And do you think we'll achieve this in our lifetime? A big question to ask in a short amount of time, but let's hear from you.
Okay, I'll give you the potted version. Is there an appetite for it? Interesting question. I think from all the work that we've done with communities here in Australia and work I've done globally for the International AIDS Society, there exists a huge appetite for a cure, both from people living with HIV for personal reasons, from countries for economic reasons, and I actually am. I'm inherently an optimist, but I am actually do think it's possible, and I think it's something we actually have to 100% still continue to work towards. Having said that, it's not going to be easy. We know that. Many people have seen this accelerated, incredible speed of science for COVID and think, well, why don't we have a vaccine yet for HIV when you can get one for COVID in 12 months? HIV is a trickier virus to create a vaccine for and also for a cure. So why am I optimistic? Well, we first of all know a cure is possible, and many in the audience will know these handful of cases of cure following a bone marrow transplant with Timothy Brown and another man in the UK, Adam Castelleo. A recent report of people that can probably get rid of all of their virus on their own. These are sort of now kind of being called extraordinary elite controls, not just elite controllers, but people, or EEC, extraordinary elite control, that when you hunt really hard, there is no full-length virus in there. And that's another woman proven to be Lorraine Willenberg, and I've been involved with another case from Argentina. So these handful of cases of cure tell us it's possible, but extremely rare. We also know that some people can control virus really on their own to very low levels after being on treatment, which is probably not so rare, and that's called post-treatment control. So these are all examples that a cure is possible. The second reason I think I'm optimistic is that we are seeing good studies coming out in monkey models. Now, monkey models are not perfect. There's a whole lot of differences to humans, but there's more and more combinations that in a monkey model, when you stop treatment, the virus can be under control. And we just heard about one of those really interesting studies just at the recent IAS. And this was the first time it was in monkeys that had established chronic infection. Most of the cures in monkeys previously are in monkeys that had acute infection, very, very early treatment, so maybe easy to cure. So this was an intervention that basically beefed up the immune system of the monkey, and they controlled the virus to really, really low levels. And finally, this is an area that we haven't talked about much at all in Australia, but it's a huge area globally, and it's a huge area scientifically that is moving really fast, and that's gene therapy. So gene therapy sounds scary, but basically gene therapy, we now have got much better ways to design these gene scissors or ways to edit the genome. And you could do that to get rid of the receptor for HIV, CCR5, and you can do that to get rid of the virus itself, literally cutting it out of someone's DNA. And the big problem with gene therapy has always been it's complicated. You've got to take all the blood out, modify it, and put all the blood in. But there's just this massive advance in what's called in vivo gene therapy, where you can inject the gene modifying or gene scissors into someone's arm. And actually, again, at the recent IAS, there was a whole session on gene therapy for cure. And at the end, it was the session was closed by Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH. So he's Tony Fauci's boss. How would you like to have that job? Anyway, he's Tony Fauci's boss. And he gave this really passionate speech about what science can achieve, how they're investing in gene therapy for HIV and also sickle cell disease, because actually for sickle cell disease, which is a sort of a blood disorder, it's really common in Africa, gene therapy cures sickle cell disease, but you can't deliver it because it's too expensive. So the NIH and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have got this big program on gene therapy just for those two areas. And the amount of progress because of this initiative. I mean, if you throw a ton of money at something, you can solve really hard problems. I've seen that with COVID. There's this initiative to get gene therapy into Africa for sickle cell disease and for HIV. And there are just so many interesting advances on how you deliver that gene therapy. So they're the reasons why I'm optimistic. It has to remain an important part of our agenda, and we need everyone's help to be advocating for it and not to just accept lifelong treatment for HIV.
Perfect, thanks, Sharon. And it's good to hear every time you talk on this topic that the discussion points are changing and moving forward, which means there is progress and there is new ways of thinking, new ways of trying to solve the problem of this tricky virus. I can see there's a question popped up in the Q&A for you, so maybe have a look at that one, and I'm sure there'll be more questions on HIV cure as the evening goes on. Remembering everybody, it's an opportunity to ask the experts the questions that are on your mind, and Sharon is at global forefront of HIV cure research, so you've got a good opportunity there tonight. The next person I'd like to introduce is Kirsty Machin. Welcome, Kirsty.
Hi, Chad. Thank you.
So for those who don't know Kirsty, Kirsty's been involved with HIV-related journalism, advocacy and policy development for over 20 years, starting with ACT UP. Kirsty was the first female chair of the VAC, which is now Thorn Harbour Health, which are hosting our event this evening, and has also worked for the Australian Federation of AIDS Organisations and NAPWA. Kirsty has worked as a policy manager and CEO of a national association representing healthcare professionals. As a consultant in the HIV sector, her work has been in areas including strategic planning, mental health, and challenging HIV-related stigma. Kirsty has a PhD in the history and philosophy of science, focused on the ethical dimensions of evolutionary theory. Welcome. My question for you, Kirsty, is given the trajectory of HIV research over the last 35 years, what do you consider to have been the major milestones in that? I know that's a big question again.
I was going to say, it's fantastic to be asked such a huge and broad question. So a couple of quick things. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that I too am on unceded land of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to any Aboriginal people in the audience tonight. I have been asked to talk about this because of my kind of long-standing experience as an advocate and ally of people living with HIV. People may know me in my role as CEO of Positive Women Victoria, but I'm not here to speak for Positive Women, not being one, and I'm also not a spokesperson for the organisation. So this is about a kind of collective sense of what I've sort of found out or kind of been able to, ascertain during my time as a journalist and as an advocate. Which goes back to 1991. And of course, the environment was very different then, as everybody knows. And I think rather than sort of talk about obvious kind of milestones, protease inhibitors and so on and so forth, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how I see changes in kind of what might be the way that research is kind of being conducted, what's been important to communities and how communities have been engaged. The very first studies that I ever reported on as a journalist, the very first HIV study was actually way back when, and it was an interleukin-2 study, which was an immune-based therapy. And immune-based therapies then were kind of being put forward as an option when antiviral therapies were not great, and the consequences of things like AZT, DDI, DDC was pretty horrific for people who had to live through those days. So IL-2 also, as it turns out, was not a great success, but at that time there was a lot of interest in immune-based therapies, and that actually really kind of got unseated over the years when antiretroviral therapies become more important to people. But with antiretroviral therapies came a whole lot of problems and issues, and part of that really generated a unique kind of model of engaging with communities and with people living with HIV and with organisations to, I suppose, find ways to kind of bridge the sort of the notion that of imperfect treatments that were, at the time when I first joined ACT UP, people were talking about a cure. What really happened for a while was a kind of something that was not a cure, nor was it perfect, and it was this period of people kind of living for with the consequences of kind of long-term illness and all of the attendant kind of issues that had around side effects. So that generated a lot of important kind of advocacy and sort of activity that I think really put people's lives and put wellbeing at the centre of kind of understanding how people kind of relate to medical developments and interventions. And study design really had to change, I think, a lot during that time. It really had to take account of and hear the voices of people. And I just want to sort of acknowledge a couple of people who I had the pleasure of working with, both of whom have since died. But I wanted to acknowledge a couple of activists, Jeff Honor and Alan Brotherton, who were dear friends of mine and really involved in this kind of move to make communities kind of more involved in HIV and create accountability for, how medical researchers took seriously the proposition of having to kind of live with very, very complex treatments. I think some of the important things that happened were the kind of National Centre in HIV Epi and Clinical Research, as it then was running, ensuring that it had really widespread community representation on groups. And some people in the audience will have been on those groups and some people would kind of be aware of them. So I think that was a fantastic and interesting and important kind of development in generating a real kind of sense of putting lived experience on people's noses and making sure that trial design was kind of taken into account really serious ethical questions. A couple of other quick things I just wanted to mention is ones around the intersection between social research and clinical research, because part of what I think this kind of thing generated was really the grounds for an important development, which was actually the Hiv Futures Study. And the Hiv Futures Study was really saying, put lived experience at the centre, find out about it, look at it in depth, take it seriously. There are other kinds of important developments that happened around that time in relation to PrEP, and some people may remember that the first PrEP studies, particularly the ones that were proposed to happen in overseas settings involving female sex workers in Southeast Asia, were very controversial. And whilst they were really important studies, it just goes to show that if you're thinking internationally and in other ways, there's a huge kind of need to really sort of bring people with you in these kind of complicated debates and engage communities in the right way. So I think the studies were well intentioned, but as a kind of exercise in PR, they ended up being something of a disaster. And I think that set back PrEP research and also some of the interests of some of the people who could have benefited from that in Southeast Asia because of that issue. The other thing I just wanted to mention while I'm here is a really small highlight. In the time I did HIV, research at NAP, was involved in HIV research issues at NAPWA, and it's just a reminder that there are always, you're not talking about a general kind of population when you talk about people living with HIV, but specific lived experiences. Because one of my favourite pieces of research that I got to report on was a really tiny study that was conducted in about 2002 or 3, I think. And it was in the needs of heterosexual men living with HIV. Nobody had looked at that in Australia. Nobody had taken that seriously. And they're still a really highly stigmatised, under kind of voiced part of the epidemic. So I kind of think that the pictures over those years has been about the many kind of ways that sort of community involvement kind of improves the research project, extending right now to the involvement of a lot of people in HIV cure research, which I can assure Sharon continues to be a major kind of interest for people. So that's a kind of summary of where I think some of the developments have gone and what I think has changed over the years.
Thanks, Kirsty, and we're blessed this evening to have yourself here with such a breadth of experience across those times in different roles in the sector and looking at both the social and other research as well. And thanks for referencing there the critical and essential role that people living with HIV, those that you've worked with in the past and work with today, have in all of the work that we do in HIV research. And it's a good segue for me to then move to the next person I'm going to ask a question for tonight, who is very much a leader of the communities of people living with HIV here in Victoria. Richard Keane, how are you?
Hey, good evening. Thanks for having me and thanks for the opportunity to engage in this session.
It's great to have you, Richard. And for those that don't know Richard is the CEO of Living Positive Victoria. He has been engaged in the Victorian HIV response across a variety of roles for over 30 years. He was diagnosed with HIV in 1989 at 19 years of age and has been a participant in and grateful recipient of HIV-related research. He was first employed in a pilot project as AIDS and injecting drug use educator at Victoria's first needle and syringe exchange program at the Prostitutes Collective of Victoria in 1990, and was the youngest member of the Victorian AIDS Ministerial Advisory Committee from 1992 to 1996. 3 decades later, he continues to champion and acknowledge the primary role of people living with HIV within biomedical and social research, both historically and into the future. It's a great blessing for us all to have Richard here with us tonight. Richard, my first question for you, from your opinion, what are the gaps in our understanding of HIV?
Well, I think there's a lack of understanding from both positive people and the broader community about how much research intersects with our daily lives and our living well and all those kinds of things. Sometimes we can take for granted the work that actually goes into contributing to those things. And Kirsty mentioned ARVs, and I was diagnosed in a time before they existed. So it was a very, very different environment, and they were life-changing and life-sustaining over that period of time. I think cure is the ultimate thing. And when I think of intersections of HIV stigma and other things, there's a part of me that kind of feels like cure is the holy grail and probably the only cure to stamp out HIV stigma eventually as well. But I also just want to acknowledge from a social research perspective here this evening, the devastation I've experienced over the last 18 months as we've seen a lack of support in and around our tertiary institutions across Australia. I've lost a number of colleagues that have been absolutely integral to the work that we do at Living Positive Victoria. I think of Jen Johnson having to move away from intersections of community practice and other really, really important partnerships that we've had with research over a number of years that have been significantly impacted by the lack of government support for our really important institutions. And so I really want to acknowledge that aspect of it. I think there's some challenges still with research. We've seen, and I'm really hopeful, what we've seen in the last 18 months is people return to really valuing research and seeing it as central to our way through viral epidemics and pandemics and all those kinds of things. But at the same time, there's still some aspects of research that are politicised. And I use the example of things that, like the New South Wales spitting laws that came in, the mandatory testing laws in New South Wales last year. We all know that they weren't based on science. It's scientific, the evidence is there that transmission of HIV can't be done via saliva and particularly spitting on a person. But there was a political undertone, there was a political imperative, there was a really strong push by the police unions to do that. Other states like Western Australia already had those systems involved, and all of a sudden the science was muted under those other arguments. So I think that the value of science is central to everything that we do, but I think there's also some challenges with the shifting perspectives of when science is adhered to and when it's not. And another thing that I'd probably like to talk about as well too, Chad, is framing a contemporary response to risk to HIV. With the biomedical advances we've had from medical cure research, a whole range of other things, and with UVL and the evidence of U equals U being supported by governments, by researchers, by community, we still have a little bit of a lack in that pick-up time between when we see those changes come in and we see that science accepted more broadly in the community and we see changes in laws around risk and criminalisation. And I think they're two really important things, but that science is there, but it's how we utilise those science, how we leverage the amazing and unique relationships that HIV has brought between research and community, and how we keep community responses central to that.
Thanks, Richard, and a great answer. I think you hit the nail on the head when you talk about the science as it then needs to turn fairly quickly into policy and practice and changes in legislation, even so that it actually has an impact on the lives of people who are either living with or affected by a pathogen that's of note. And I think in HIV, this is something we've done, really well, engaging community and looking at the science and getting community to engage with that science to see how they turn that into changes for themselves and for the people around them. thank you for making that link. And I think the whole thing really is about that nexus or that intersection between science, community, and what the government is willing to really focus on. And hopefully the current pandemic that we're all going through with COVID actually doesn't detract from government interest in community organisations that look at something like HIV and actually refocuses attention and funding back to, that acknowledgement that community is central to actually ending the pandemic, and that the HIV pandemic has been with us for a long time, and until we get that cure, we'll be with us for some time to come, but hopefully that cure is coming quickly. Speaking of cure, the next person is somebody, a researcher who works on that and other areas of HIV, and I would like to introduce Associate Professor James Mcmahon. Welcome, James.
Hi, Chad, how are you?
Good, thanks. So James is an infectious diseases clinician researcher, head of the infectious diseases clinical research unit at the Alfred Hospital, and also an ID physician at Monash Medical Centre. His research interests are in clinical trials focused on HIV cure, antiretroviral therapy, the cascade of HIV care, and also now COVID-19. He chairs the Antiretroviral Guidelines Committee and sits on the board of the Australian Society of HIV Medicine, ASHM. And he also sits on the treatment panel for the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force. I have a lot of experience and accolades there for James. But James, my question for you is, what are the obstacles to future breakthroughs in HIV research?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chad. And thanks for that generous introduction and being invited to this webinar. Lots of things are potential obstacles. We sort of need to do everything at once to make sure we keep moving forward. It's funny, I've been involved in some discussions around this actually just due to COVID. When we've been impacted in terms of research, you were sort of talking about it before. There's obviously a huge focus on COVID, and as Sharon said, a lot of money thrown at it in terms of research. And we've sort of been, one of the things we've been looking at is trying to keep doing our HIV research and how that would impact on our HIV research. And I think in the end, we think that it's got to be an overall benefit. It's got to be a win. And so many of the people doing a lot of COVID research have been HIV researchers and communities involved in it. So hopefully that's going to be a fillip actually for HIV research, because in the end, one of these main obstacles is maintaining the focus on HIV, right? And there's the old chestnut of funding, which we all deal with in community-based organisations and research as well. So funding is just absolutely critical for us to be able to keep going. And how do we do that? Well, we have to constantly advocate to maintain research, and whether that is with leadership in the space, people maintaining that focus on HIV research, whether that is people in the community advocating for research. And obviously the HIV community has been fantastic at advocating for the cause of people with HIV. And one of those things could be advocating for the science and research. So that's a really important part of why we've had such advances over the years. And we need, another big part of it, I think, is we need people. I think that in terms of the research space, sometimes things move to the latest and greatest, and there can be sometimes a feeling that this is not within our community, but across the broader scientific community, that you can get things that then, this is now more of a sorted problem. We've got antiretroviral therapy, things going well, or with Hep C, they've got treatments of Hep C now, everyone can be cured of Hep C. But we need to maintain that focus and get people interested and engaged. So it's incumbent upon like lots of people on this call and listening to sort of maintain that level of interest and advocate for research and get people interested in being researchers and asking the questions. So I think that's a really big part of it. And we are constantly looking for people to engage in the space and work in HIV research. And sorry, no, it's okay. I'll fix it later. Sorry, I'm at work, someone's going to the door. And another critical part of doing any research is people, participants, right? And I think we are particularly lucky. I sort of come from in ID physician space, and in terms of doing research in infections and things. And we're extremely lucky to have the community we have that in general are very engaged, and there's just this constant. When I talk to people about research in the HIV space, there's a constant theme of people wanting to give back. There's a real altruism and people wanting to give back for the benefits that they have received from people who have gone before them. So many have obviously died. So we're extremely lucky, I think, in that space. So, but yeah, there's sort of, I suppose I've sort of gone through a few tin tacks. It's leadership and money and people and participants, but I think they're truths. And there's a lot of important questions still to answer and ask. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, James. And I, just ponder as you're talking there, the role of community itself to be the actual advocates for more funding for HIV research and how important that is, because researchers asking for more funding all the time seems a little bit perhaps self-interested in the sense of their careers. But if the community are the ones actually standing up and saying, we want more research on this particular virus that is affecting our lives, that is a whole different angle in terms of hitting to the politicians and the policymakers who make those decisions.
It was funny. I was having a conversation about expedited review, for drugs. And I said, well, that where this all started, this was with community activism, to try and get these life-saving drugs approved. And that's another example of that review process that was established around antiretroviral drugs. The populations are benefiting from that now in COVID because those expedited review processes exist. So, we're extremely lucky to have such an active community in this space. But in the end, I think the strength of that, overcoming those obstacles, is working together. It's obviously not the responsibility of community or researchers, but it's everyone with a constant message moving forward that we still have important problems to solve, and science is an important part of that. And I think that's probably another huge benefit of COVID, right? Like there's a huge movement to say, follow the science, understand the science. The science will solve these really big problems. I think people with HIV really understand that more than most, actually. So,
yeah, exactly. And also getting the community to actually understand the science, but engage with it, and then request more, as you said earlier.
Yeah, we could always do a better job of communicating about science, I think, and we need to be heavily critiqued. I think if researchers are talking about something and they're not making sense, please stop us and say, please, no, you're going to break it down and make it digestible and understandable. And that's a really critical part of going the next step, isn't it?
Sure. I mean, and that's what these discussion events are all about. The Thorn Harbour Office put on for us all is to bring researchers and community together and to try and reinvigorate those discussions and build stronger partnerships between the two, so that we can do this the right way and actually make a difference in some of those areas that still have unanswered questions or areas where we need change. But thanks for that. I can see a question from Brent Allen for you specifically in the Q&A, so maybe you want to have a look at that and either type it or come back. And thanks, Brent, for your questions. Invite other participants to write your questions in the Q&A as well. I would like to introduce our final panelist for this evening. Again, somebody who's not a stranger to the sector and someone with a wealth of experience. It's Dr. Edwina Wright. Welcome, Edwina.
Hey, Chad. Hello there.
Edwina is an infectious diseases physician and clinical researcher at the Alfred Hospital Central Clinical School, Monash University. She has honorary affiliations with Burnett Institute and the Peter Doherty Institute. Dr. Wright began her HIV clinical research career in 1993 at the Fairfield Hospital, and her research expertise lies in the areas of the benefits of early treatment, HIV prevention, notably PrEP, HIV cure, and HIV neurological disorders. Dr. Wright is the past president of ASHM, and she is the chair of ASHM's COVID-19 task force. Welcome.
Thanks, Chad.
My first question for you this evening is, to your mind, what are the urgent priorities of the future of HIV research?
Yeah, thanks for a great question. And all the questions this evening have been terrific, just to give you that feedback. I think how we frame the urgency of HIV research and how we choose and pilot the direction of HIV research are sort of almost equally important, you could argue. And what I mean by framing is that I think that I'm very concerned that over the next decade, even within the next half a decade, that we are going to run into a lot of problems with things like climate change, local disasters, changes in government, big changes in relationships with China, and sort of a generally unsettled planet where money is going to have to be spent doing a whole lot of other things that are not necessarily related to science and not necessarily related to HIV, and specifically not necessarily being related to HIV. And so how we frame the need to undertake HIV research has to be done in a certain way. And I think the idea that we can end the idea of setting up a sense of urgency around ending HIV transmission and curing HIV transmission and making that very urgent and to be done in the next decade is really important, because I think I'm very worried we're going to be overrun by climate change and perhaps another major outbreak of one or more different pandemics where money will just be gone. So I do think that we need to do that and frame it as an urgency, with some countries getting there ahead of others and teaching others behind them. How did you get there? How did you reduce transmissions? Especially around the transmission issue, using PrEP and treatment as prevention and other effective measures, and then cure research will come along with it. But in terms of actual research, what I think is urgent is probably three key things all to happen in parallel, and they are implementation research, such that you get PrEP to people, you get treatment to people. How do you do it? Now, some of that might be about understanding and working at a higher political level, so it becomes in countries that are not paying attention or not wanting to spend money on that do spend money. But the implementation research and getting people onto treatment, which will stop HIV transmission, getting people having access to PrEP so that they don't acquire HIV. And in tandem, and the big engine running behind that are two things: vaccines and cure research, because cure research is obviously critical for many reasons, but presumably people who are cured could be plausibly reinfected. So you're going to need vaccines to stop people from being infected in the first place or reinfected in the second place. So cure and vaccine research should be seen, I think, almost hand in hand as chief priorities, and getting populations en masse on treatment or on key preventive strategies and figuring out how to do it. For me, that's the urgency in a sort of a big picture sense.
Yeah, thanks, Edwina. The end of transmissions is a big one, and I think we've discussed in the previous time as well, as we get to the pointy end of it, and we do see those reductions in transmission going down in Australia, at least.
Yeah.
It becomes harder to get to that zero, right?
Well, yes, and it's very interesting to, once you start learning about, what are the definitions of transmission, ending transmission, and of course, it doesn't mean zero transmissions. It's a technical definition, if you like. Per however many thousand people or however many 100,000 people, you only have one infection per that many people at risk. So it ends up being a little bit like, other infections. We still have outbreaks of polio. We still have outbreaks, believe it or not, of, rabies and all sorts of things, tiny little pockets. But that's sort of where you'd be looking for very rare clusters of infection. And I think the more people understand what does ending HIV transmission mean and how would you get there, and have other countries got there, or are they close, and you find out actually some countries are super close to meeting those definitions, then you start to get energized and imagine it actually happening in your own country. And it probably will only happen first. The first 10 to 15, most of the countries that get there first will be high income, WHO defined high-income countries. So yeah, that's what I think.
Great, thanks. I would like to ask all of our panelists if they're willing to put their cameras back on so that we can turn it into a panel discussion as we go forward, and remind the audience of who we have before us to ask questions of. Sharon, I've got a question for you. Edwina was talking, about, intersections there in terms of maybe the future of research on HIV as it interplays with other things like the climate and other matters. So thinking about it in that regard, are interdisciplinary models the best way forward in HIV research?
Yes, I think so. I think what interdisciplinary means to me is using multiple different tools and skills to tackle a problem. So Richard mentioned earlier about, social research and clinical research and fundamental research. It's, that is how you solve big problems, and that's been the real secret to success, I think, with HIV, because you can, have a great discovery, and then you've got the challenge of how you implement it. And that's been such a success story in the HIV world. In my universe around, in more the sort of discovery science, and, the interdisciplinarity to me also means learning from other challenges. So I talked earlier about this gene, why I was so excited about the gene therapy issues, because there's this huge driver to solve one problem, which is sickle cell disease, and the spin-off will be for HIV. And I saw that this question from the wonderful Brent Allen, who I haven't seen for ages. Hi, Brent. About why HIV is tricky, and then whether there'll be benefits from the COVID investment. And just very, very quickly, HIV is different because HIV integrates, HIV changes. We don't have a natural model for clearance of HIV, as opposed to COVID, where everyone clears it. So we know exactly the kind of antibodies you need to generate, because you just mimic what people do on their own. HIV, we don't have that. And so we don't really know what is exactly required from a vaccine to prevent infection. Will COVID, but all this work in mRNA will definitely have an impact on the ways we tackle and design vaccines. I don't know of anyone working on mRNA vaccines in Australia, but for HIV, but I have spoken to people internationally. It's not that straightforward. mRNA vaccines do look fabulous and are fabulous for COVID, but that's because we know exactly the kind of antibody to generate. With HIV mRNA vaccines, people are still having this problem of finding what we call the immunogen. Like in the vaccines, we have spike, which is the protein that gives you the right antibodies, protects you from COVID. In HIV, designing that immunogen is a bit more tricky. So it won't be direct, but there'll be others, more than just vaccines. The field of antibodies is just going to explode with COVID. It's probably at the moment the only real, and there will be better antivirals, I'm sure, but it's the main antiviral. It works as an antibody, and we're going to get better at manufacturing them, administering them, all sorts of things. So I think that's going to have a big impact. And then the last thing with COVID, have a huge effect on diagnostics, because just bring back to cure. One big thing when if you do a treatment interruption studies, you've got to keep going back to hospital or to a practitioner to check your viral load. Well, through COVID, I'm sure we're going to get home-based viral load testing, etc. So there's going to be loads of advances, and I think picking up a little bit from Edwina, we've got to be really smart in the HIV world and think how we will leverage this going forward, rather than seeing COVID as a threat for taking away funds. How will the lessons from COVID really impact the big challenges in HIV?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And you mentioned there the people living with HIV who are going to be part of those HIV cure things. I mean, it can be a big task of somebody to be involved, to have to go and do repeat visits, and to put their time and their energy and their body on the line. And it's so critical, and we've heard from many of the speakers tonight about that role of people living with HIV and all of this research, be it biomedical research or social research or pure research or whatever it is, it's absolutely essential that the community is engaged. My question, I'm going to fire off to you first, Kirsty, but anyone can jump in really about how do we ensure that we get the community engaged with HIV research as we go forward. I mean, a lot of the community have been engaged for so long, maybe they're a little bit tired, maybe they don't see what their role is going forward. What do you think is the way that we can get the community more engaged with HIV research from here on?
So there's two aspects to that. One is engagement, and the other question is actually participation. Clearly, during the late 1990s in particular, the method for keeping people engaged was, that it was very much present to people. Part of it was about getting access to antiretroviral therapy. People could get access if they went on to trials, and people wanted to contribute to the development of trials because sometimes they were wanting and lacking, sometimes they weren't asking the right questions, and sometimes it was just a means to kind of make sure that people felt like that they were being heard and that trials were inclusive of people's experiences and fears. So that's one aspect. But in the present time is that there's a sort of more interesting kind of aspect to that. And one of the ways it's arisen for me is some work that we've been doing through Positive Women about engagement of women in pure research. And whilst I don't want to preempt the results of that research while the data analysis is still happening, I will say that it's given me a number of insights and surprised me. And my involvement was to interview sort of clinicians who shared their thoughts about the ways about what the barriers to participation of women in clinical research might be. And some of what people said was not necessarily what I expected, and also there were things that were raised by both the women who were interviewed, women living with HIV, and the clinicians that really surprised me. One of the things that I think is probably relevant around engaging people is the success of antiretroviral therapy and the fact that a lot of people are just sort of getting on with their lives. So that may be a barrier to this. And, people who have been long-term participants in the community might think I've done my time. New people might think, well, I've got reasons for not sort of needing to engage. And we actually need to sort of see that is kind of justifiable. I don't think there's an obligation on everyone to be an advocate all the time. But there are a couple of relevant sort of things for some groups. I think for women in particular, we tend to forget that the number of women living with HIV in Australia is just tiny. And then a lot of newly diagnosed women are not necessarily from communities that would participate or engage in research. There might be sort of certain fears, but another kind of aspect of it is that I think that a lot of people don't put forward women whose language might not be English, for example, first language, because they can, about the consent process and other things. So there's lots of complexities around engaging communities because you're really trying to engage, especially when you're talking about how do you bring in harder to reach communities that people like to have included in studies. But that brings me to one point I just want to make about research priorities and questions. And I still kind of continue to kind of think that we need to push the way social questions inform clinical questions and make sure that keeps happening. I think there is an onus on people in an over-tested community and with limited kind of resources in terms of, for example, access to women who might be in trials, to make sure that the right kinds of questions are being asked, that they're actually the same priorities that the community kind of wants to put forward for research. But I actually think that there's a underspoken kind of thing that we need to understand more about it, and I think we need a bit of definitive research really on it in Australia, and that's around the impact of stigma and shine a light into those dark places where we know that stigma is the issue, but we don't understand how it works, but we also don't understand how to address it. We don't understand how you kind of address HIV-related stigma in a way that engages communities without putting people in the firing line, without re-traumatising them, without requiring a set of individuals to constantly be obliged to share their own story in the absence of some buy-in from the community about addressing stigma. And I think these things all need to kind of tie in. So I just wanted to kind of say that I think that addressing stigma and understanding how stigma operates will be a big sort of step forward to re-engaging people and giving them the confidence to engage in research.
Yeah, great point. And in touching on that, what are the research priorities question, the next part of that for me really is how do we ensure that those voices of people living with HIV are heard in terms of choosing what are the priorities, so that the priorities are being set by the people who have HIV, probably even more so than being set by the researchers, so that the researchers are responding to what they need. And Richard, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on that, around how do we how do we hear that voice of positive people early in the piece around what are the research priorities and topics, not down the track when the grants have already gone in, the NHMRC has signed the funding, the protocol's been written, the ethics application has to go in, and the engagement starts there. How do we hear those voices right at the beginning?
I think we've had some success over the journey with our relationships that we've built up. There's community advisory boards. I know at the Doherty, I've had the privilege to be part of that process and to be able to have those conversations around small grants for research and how they might be allocated, and to feed back in, and also to try and engage via those systems to find enablers to add diversity to those areas as well. I'm really optimistic about the future and the voice, the HIV voice being involved. I only have to look around within my own organisation. I've got a PhD student. I've got 2 part-time staff who are finishing their Masters in Public Health. We've had Graham Brown as a researcher in residence in our organisation in the last couple of years. And so in some ways, I feel that the good quality of life, physical well-being that's come from ARVs and sustained and affordable access to those gives us a great sense of privilege here, but also gives me real hope to see people just aiming for where their heart is and really getting involved at every level of the response. However, I think it's really, really important that we don't leave behind non-academic voices within this framework. I think what adds value from my perspective in my role at Living Positive Victoria, it's the peer navigation program, it's the Public Speakers Bureau, it's engaging our community from grassroots up. And those programs keep me abreast of emerging issues and the ever diversifying communities that we engage with as well. And I think just to follow on from what Edwina was saying before, because I think she's raised some really important points, and sometimes even as a positive person within our own community, it's really hard to feel safe to raise some of those issues and to kind of ring the warning bell about the potential of reduced ability for services in the future and reduced funding in a funding constrained environment and what that might look like. And that requires hard conversations about future potential mergers 5 or 10 years down the line, both at the national and state level, and a whole range of other things. But because of the time that's been invested in those relationships, I still believe that if our circumstances do shift over the next decade, we have the foundation to ensure that the models moving forward remain with the positive voice at the centre of it. I think we've shown through our history and the response in this country, and it's a real privilege to be kind of a Victorian and to have seen the progress over those many years. I believe we have the foundations to make those adjustments into the future, but I think it reinforces the importance of having systems that have positive people in those oversight opportunities. And I think at a national level, via our national peaks, I really think that there should be an oversight committee that engages a whole range of research that's happening across the nation and gives people opportunities to feed in and to really have input into the design. We talk about things like co-design and other things like that. I've only seen it work well probably a handful of times. It seemed to be a buzzword a few years ago, but since then it's become a lot more refined and a lot more engaging. So as well as some challenges ahead of us, I also am very optimistic about our future and the positive voice.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And you mentioned peer navigators there, so people living with HIV peer navigators. There's a question from Brent for you, James, but happy for anyone to answer that. If we really are going to use those peer navigators in the clinical research and the whole way through, how do we consider that? I mean, it's obviously going to have costs and other implications, but how do we get to that point?
It's really difficult. I mean, I think we're all drinking from the same, that's writing from the same page. You know, we all agree about co-design, participatory research, engagement community. There's no problems there. I think that there's some really practical difficulties about the way a lot of research is conducted. Like we live in this world where we get quickly said, oh, there's this opportunity and you've got to quickly develop a proposal, and you quickly develop it and you try and have community engagement as quick as you can before the thing's submitted and funded. So the practical realities are very difficult. It makes me think actually of, again, obviously COVID's always in our brain, but a lot of the ways we've responded to COVID, we said that what we needed to do better was to have these things already sort of funded and existing, like platforms to do certain activities. So if you had an ongoing platform for the engagement around questions that are important to people with HIV, and there was resource to support that ongoing activity, then when bigger opportunities came available, it is up and going and it's running, versus the sort of the model that we all live in is a bit reactive. We get told that here's an opportunity and we have to jump on it. So ways, and I think things like community, ad boards and or the Cure Consortium and things like that, they're good models, but they need resources to support them. In terms of the PIN navigators and community advocates, I think that's sort of where it comes in. It's sort of that ability to have ongoing engagement, dedicated time to understand what those questions are, and then build them in right from the outset. That is the perfect sort of situation if you could develop that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. The resources are needed there from the beginning, I think, to support that co-design model. And with the Cure Consortium that the Doherty are leading on, which was, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Sharon, but state government funded here in Victoria, they really put that funding into that model at the beginning to make sure that community engagement was right there up and at centre from day one. Is that right?
Yep, that was Victorian government.
Yeah, so hopefully there's a lesson learned there for models with all donors that needs to be built into these as we go forward.
So can I ask Sharon and James in particular, perhaps, and maybe Edwina, what do you think are the unique challenges that are around engagement in people in kind of early stage kind of research? Because the considerations for people participating in a phase 1 cure study are really different to participating in a phase 3 sort of antiretroviral study. And how do you kind of, and so the motivations for people participating will be different. The risks are very high. There's particular issues around people who might be of sexual health, reproductive age, and thinking about children. Many, many kinds of issues. How do you, and also the science is actually very esoteric. We've had people sort of come and say things like, how would you engage women whose first language isn't English in these studies? And there's a huge kind of question about what resources are available to even translate some of this complicated science in a manner that is going to be kind of understood, where people would feel that informed consent isn't a barrier, for example. So what do you think are some of the unique issues, and are there things that could address those?
I can have a stab at that, Sharon, if you like. I mean, it's a fascinating question. You'd be very interested to hear that a lot of the main issues are the practical realities of just being able to do it. Getting back to that altruism side, often when you explain the risks associated with an intervention, many people are quite happy, and actually they have a very good understanding of risk. They've spent their lives dealing with risk. And whether that is risks in their day-to-day lives, whether it's risks around drugs, so they often understand and can process that. But the practical realities of coming to the hospital every week, being available at this time, the competing priorities around their job or their family or caring, they're actually often the bigger issues for people. If you get onto those other issues, what you said about, for example, you're talking about women, we love enrolling women in cure trials, and it is extraordinarily difficult because they often have a lot more competing priorities, actually. They're often younger, they have care roles, they work, and some of those studies are pretty intensive. So, and I work at Monash as well, and for example, there's more women there, but it's more cold communities. So English not first language does present a barrier because they're pretty complicated concepts a lot of the time, and you have to be very comfortable if you're consenting someone or talking about a study, they really understand those risks. We're very risk averse, actually. So there is additional barriers there, but we really do try, because we know there's a massive issue in that space in terms of enrolment, that it's largely men. So there's some of the practical things we deal with. And we're dealing with these right at the moment. We've been able to start seeing people again, and there's a couple of cure trials that got put on hold, but we've started talking to people again, and which has been great that we're able to do that actually. Yeah. And if anyone's interested, please Google me and send me an email, and I can tell you more about it. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, Kirsty. It is a totally different sort of population that would do than people that have been doing antiviral trials for a very long period of time, especially in the early days. I think though cure research is a spectrum. It's not all high risk interventional studies. There are certainly some high risk, high interventional, lots of time being a major barrier. Then there are other studies which are donating blood, which is hugely important. All of the and that can be small amounts or very large amounts through something called leukapheresis, which we have running at the Alfred. And that's it's a one-off blood donation. It's 4 hours of your time, of someone's time. Major impact, because the best way to look at drugs that alter the virus in people on treatment is actually using patient blood rather than using models and laboratory models. So I think there's a spectrum of activity. It doesn't always mean a high, or it can be an observational study. Edwina has just finished this fantastic observational study that was a sub-study of START that looked at the effects of your CD4 count at starting antiretroviral therapy above 500. So if they're super high, what happens? And it shows if they're super high, then you have a really tiny reservoir on ART. So there's all different types of research. All of it is very valuable. We get very focused on, interventional stuff, but in fact, we're at the stage of discovery still. So all of the other parts of the other contributions are incredibly important. And then sometimes the intervention can be quite low risk too. So we did recently a study, we're just finishing that up, on high dose vitamin D. So that was a different type of population. We actually recruited people through the community, largely, actually just open advertisement, and all of them were outpatient based at Alfred, Melbourne Sexual Health and Royal Melbourne, but we advertised it more broadly in the community, and people heard about it in the local papers or online sites. So, and that, because that's a pretty easy study, but important study. So I think there's lots of different ways community can intersect, and the high risk intervention, that's sort of one end, important, but it's just one aspect.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Sharon, and also James, that there's a range of different sacrifices I guess people make depending on the trial that they choose to be part of. There's a specific question there from someone tonight saying, if I do cure research, does that mean I can't do new treatments? What is the answer to that one? If they participate in a cure trial, would it mean that they couldn't take new drugs as they became available down the track?
So it's a really good question. It's probably trial specific. I don't think it would interfere with new antiviral drugs. There will be some limitations while you're on the study, most likely, of new or different antivirals. Sometimes people worry that, if a really promising intervention came along and you'd already been in this current study, would you be excluded from futures? It's hard to predict that. Some of our studies right now exclude people that have been in a cure study. It's not forever, but in the last 2 years. So they all vary a bit. I don't think it would be a barrier at all for new antivirals in the future. New cure studies they're all a bit different.
Sure. There's another question there in the Q&A about participatory action-oriented community-based research. My feeling would be that that's what we've been referring to tonight in terms of co-design. Is that what other people on the panel see as the answer to that question? That co-design is that process of where the community and the researchers design the piece together in discussion and plan out how they're going to do the piece of work. Otherwise called participatory action-oriented community research, depending on the context. So hopefully we're going to see more co-design in place and the system set up to help researchers be able to access those communities right at the beginning, as you said, James. A platform where somebody who's got some research ideas knows where to go straight away to engage with the community right at day number one. And I think that's something that we're all looking is some clarity around how best we can have that platform here in Australia and where to go to. We've talked a little bit about funding tonight too. Edwina, I wanted to ask you a question about the money, because without the money, it's really hard to do anything really. And we know in Australia, at least, HIV is becoming and seen now as a chronic manageable condition, which is great for people living with HIV. But how does that impact us in terms of, having people still interested in throwing money at the kind of research that we want to do in the HIV realm?
So I think it's a great question, and for me to answer it, I sort of, if I may, just try and unfold it in a few ways. So I was really struck by a presentation at IAS just recently, and I think Sharon had a lot to do with setting up that study, and people on the panel participated in the conference, and that was about finding high rates of cardiovascular risk factors in younger people. And it was a big study from the UK, people under 40, and compared them to people over 40 and matched them to people in the UK who are HIV negative, and looked at cardiovascular sort of risks, and found that even in young people, they were really high. So I know as a clinician, and whatever the reasons are for that, presumably multifactorial, and I know sort of a mea culpa as a clinician that I think myself and my peers, we often want to reassure people as they come onto treatment that they'll have a long life and it'll be healthy, they can have children, they can do so many things, not transmit the virus. And you very much want to make people feel that they just take a tablet a day and then just get on with their lives. And that's all good. That's, you just want to do that. But I wonder if that in a sense can be a little misleading, especially if you're going to be on a treatment for 30 plus years. Let's say not, because we're going to have a cure and a vaccine in 10. We've agreed on that earlier in the call. But let's say it is like 20 or 30 years. So perhaps that's a little bit disingenuous, albeit well-meaning for clinicians to keep reassuring people that way, but that awful saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So do we want to make people feel uncomfortable? Do we want to make, as a clinician, our patients feel uncomfortable, and do we have a right to do so? Well, it sort of struck me just thinking about this question earlier today, that if you think about going out into the sun these days and walking, there's this uncomfortable memory starts building in your brain that I'm not wearing a hat, or I haven't put on blockout. We've got this thing where we've been successfully made to feel very, very uncomfortable by very long campaigns in this country with the world's leading rates of skin cancer. We know that it's the wrong thing to do. We feel uncomfortable, and that's been very deliberate. So we have this constant memory coming up and down, especially, of course, during spring and summer. So that's a level of discomfort that the trade-off is that we slip, slop and slap, and our doctors and ourselves, we get our skin checked. So the trade-off for that discomfort is we get checked and protected, and hopefully we reduce our rates of melanoma and SCC. So how are we going to ask younger people, especially young people in their 20s, and even older people in their 60s or 70s who may have fewer years, of course, to live, and maybe living with poor quality of life? How fair is it to ask them to be uncomfortable with the idea that maybe HIV is always you're close to getting your skin burnt, even if you're on treatment, from a toxicity or uncontrolled inflammation, or whatever that will be. And I think we can keep that level of vigilance / discomfort going by a few different ways. One is, I think, as Sharon mentioned, we can engage people in big observational studies where you look for signals for toxicity or new science gets picked up in these prospective studies. But also, just as that UK study I referred to earlier, the way, as I understand that they were able to make these observations about higher cardiovascular risk in younger people was because of the way that they set up their health system with registries and health systems that talk to other health systems, so you can pull out really big data, and then sort of almost metadata. So that's fairly painless, but you would be telling people as they come into the health system, your data is going to be collected, or could you go into this cohort because we're really concerned about the long-term impacts of HIV and we want to monitor it throughout your lifetime. We want you to be part of a system that is looking out for you and looking for opportunities to have new interventions or make new discoveries. So I think having bigger, and they don't necessarily going to give you pay dirt early. You know, you're a little in there for those big studies, registries, and data sharing and cohorts. You're sort of in for the long haul a bit. So I think, need to probably improve that in Australia and have money invested in that. We don't think cohorts are cool, or they don't seem to be straight from the bench to the bedside so much, but I think that's a lack of wisdom and foresight. And then I think, gratis to COVID, we change our model, and James has done a brilliant job of this with the Virco study, where you start going to the patient. You don't necessarily drag people into the big institution, the hospital, you go to them, you adapt to them, because people's lives are so busy. Our younger people, they talk about our younger people having 2 or 3 different careers. Many of them have 3 jobs at once, and they're called fully employed. How are they going to come in and make time? So an adaptation to change, change our model of research, and change re-emphasize the way we bring data together. I think that's how we keep the level of discomfort is still there, but it's offset by, putting people into big studies where it's not too painless. Thanks.
Sure, good answer, Edwin. And I was actually going to ask James his thoughts too on, because he works on COVID now and HIV. How do we keep that focus on funding for HIV? But I'm kind of more interested to ask James, now that you've mentioned he's changed his models about going to community rather than trying to bring community to him. If you could just talk briefly to that, James, to explain that to the audience.
Oh, that was just, thanks, Edwina. Big shout out there. So it's a study that we're doing in COVID, and we're going to people's homes to recruit them to a treatment study, because that's where most people have COVID. And if you intersect early in COVID, you might prevent later disease. So, and it was just more complicated because you've got to go into the homes of people with very infectious virus, and it's not straightforward. We think about those things with, again, we go about those cure studies, but decreasing the burden on people with HIV, and there's trials, and it would help if we could go and do some of the study procedures where people live, where they work, getting around some of the issues that Edwina said. There's actually a survey, I think, went around from community on some of those aspects. And so I think that's really important. We need to keep thinking about those things and making the experience more easy to do. That's a great example of, community involvement and design. That is a classic thing the community would be better at telling us to do, rather than us thinking about sitting here in our silos and things like that. So, the more, it's always obviously having novel ways to do things, be they interventions, and like that. Another example was not always saying, even as simple as a blood draw. We have models now where they can be done in private collection labs near where people live. So we actually now do that more and more and more, because if you said to someone, do you want to come over to the Alfred, or do you want to go and just do it around the corner? Well, I'm just doing the corner. Like it's a no-brainer, isn't it? So, we need to keep thinking about all those things to make participation safer and more acceptable all the time. Yep.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. There's a comment from Gillian. Thanks for that in the chat there, and the link that you put there too, Gillian, about the RIO trial in the UK. Is an interventional HIV cure broadly neutralising antibody trial with treatment interruption that's just starting. They have emphasised the early and integrated involvement of community in the study design. So good point there about that engagement of community right at the beginning, and it kind of links to what our participant Anth has put there about the respect he has for the panel tonight and their expertise, but that there is no shortage of academic brilliance amongst us. But the irony, perhaps, is that it's not balanced enough by lived experience, and that's a reasonable, good comment. And perhaps we should have more of a balanced panel in these discussions where there are more people living with HIV than researchers or equal numbers. So thanks for that comment, Anth, as well. We're kind of coming towards the end of the evening, and I wanted to do a sort of a little bit of a plug for the next one of these, which is the last one in our series. And, I think you can't turn on the radio or the TV these days without people talking about the variants and the Delta variant and this and that and contact tracing and how it's all working for COVID. And it's almost like everybody in society now has a greater understanding of these things in epidemiology and how we use the science to understand in each case, what is the variant of the virus there, and that helps us to link back through that contact tracing to where it may have come from and to track where it may be going. So it's really interesting, cutting edge science being used all the time at the moment as we look at COVID, and it helps us try to get on top of that and control that. The next time that we come together, we're going to look at molecular epidemiology and how that might be used in the context of HIV, which I think is fascinating. And very much tonight we're talking about the future of HIV research. We're using that in COVID live as we all face the world now. And so how are we going to use that in HIV? And I think, Sharon, you're joining us next week, and your colleague Deborah Williamson from the Doherty will be with us as well as other speakers.
Yeah, and here's another good COVID story. So Chad mentioned variants, which we use genomics for, which is suddenly like my mother knows what a variant is, I love it. Like everyone, like people talk about genomics and mRNA, like with the taxi driver, everyone knows this stuff now. It's fantastic. But we've been doing all the genomics for COVID in Victoria, and the genome for COVID is about 10 times the size of HIV, and it's done in 24 hours because we need it for contact tracing. You go and get your genotype for HIV, takes 2 or 3 weeks, right? So we're going to have that will have to change. We will soon have genomic, we hope, you get your genotype within 24 hours. Why should it take 3 weeks? Anyway, so, but then there's a lot more complexity about linking people, of course. And we've been talking about this with Richard and Chad and others at Thorn Harbour about how you bring those tools into the HIV world, but yet make sure that everyone's protected and there's no, we remove it from criminalisation and all the other complexities, which we just have we don't think about in COVID, but of course in HIV is a very big deal. But the technology will make it just easier and easier now.
Yes, exactly. So I think that forum is going to be super interesting for the community and for the researchers alike, and that intersection. So please, to everybody, share the word about that coming up on the 11th of August. So it's 2 weeks from today, because as you said, Sharon, and I see Richard nodding along there, the implications and complexities of what this actually means for the community and for people living with HIV are incredible. And it's also a cutting edge science, which may help us get through to that pointy end of ending the epidemic. So there's such great potential there, but also potentially some risks that we need to make sure that we're mitigating and have that voice of the community so deeply in this process that we do it right. And we do it right from the beginning. So that will be a great discussion. So looking forward to that in 2 weeks' time. Did any of the panelists have any final thoughts they wanted to share before we close off this evening? No? I would like to thank everybody for your time, both our excellent panelists this evening and all of you as the attendees and participants for your questions, and for those of you watching live on Facebook. Also want to say thank you to Thorn Harbour Health for providing these session forums and bringing us all together so that we can talk about these critical issues, and hopefully reinvigorate the focus on community working together with researchers to do HIV research the right way and make that difference that leads to those policy and practice changes that we're all looking for, and to get that cure that James and Sharon and Rena and others will get for us very quickly. So have a good evening, everybody, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank
Thank you.